Greetings, programs, and welcome to a new episode of the Awesome Friday Podcast, the only podcast where we review 2 new things every week.
The only podcast that does that.
The only podcast where we do it,
Right. That's the big difference, isn't it? That's us doing it.
Yeah, we are the differentiators. It is true. My name is Matthew, and with me, as is usual, is Simon. Say further hello, Simon.
Hello.
Say your 7th hello, Simon.
Hello. I just feel like, I'm just trying to help you out. Just help you out by saying hello multiple times.
I mean, yeah, I can just cut around and choose the best one. That's how that works, right?
Well, then use this one from the deeply disappointing Kenobi series. Hello, which is how I greet my dog every time I see him now. Which is the bad guy who dies and spoiler, he's not really dead. The Inquisitor, really bad, comes back and greets the person who had double-crossed him and left him for dead with the most perfect hello. And now that's how I greet my dog every day. It's wonderful.
I mean, I do greet people often by saying hello there. But that's really more from the prequel movies and the Clone Wars TV show than anything else.
You have the ginger beard to carry it off, though, and your Alec Guinness stroke Ewan McGregor impression is on point. So,
well, thank you for saying so. I generally make it a point to not do accents in front of people who have those or related accents because it feels like folly. But thank you for that. I appreciate it.
Yes, my friend Alec Guinness would be honoured by your impression. I'm sure.
Or spinning in his grave. It's definitely one of the two. Yep.
So how are you? How are you feeling? You sound much better. We were just having this conversation. I've got a little eye infection, but both of our voices seem pretty great this week. As a voice update, neither of us is choking to death.
Yes, neither of us have colds, flus, or COVIDs this week, which is a welcome change from the last month or so.
Give it a few days.
No, things are generally good. Vancouver Film Festival wrapped up. I don't know if the listeners, had a chance to listen to our 2 episodes on the festival, but we did 2 episodes and they were both really fun to do. Simon, you saw 2 things at Film Fest, I think.
The Simon Film Festival is 2 movies. That's correct.
Yeah, good, awesome. I think we're hoping to get into a few more festivals before the end of the year. You're hoping to get into one. I was like, I shouldn't go crazy and apply to a bunch of film festivals this year, and then I proceeded to apply to 4 more festivals. So
yeah, I say because I really want to do Vancouver Asian Film Festival, so I've applied for that. I've also applied to Fantasia, as you have, I believe, or is that finished now? Has that been and gone?
Fantasia was in August, yeah.
And we've also had an invite for Whistler Film Fest. So I don't know if you're going to squeeze that in December as well.
We've already put in our application for that, so yes.
Okay. So yes, all of the festivals. Still.
Yeah, I really like Whistler Film Festival. Actually, it's a smaller festival for sure, but they often have a ton of Canadian content, which in my old age I've come to appreciate a lot.
That's your thing at the moment, isn't it? This last year has been, I want to cover more Canadian stuff. Like I want to be a Canadian drum beater, which is
a little bit, yeah. I mean, it's we are a fully functioning nation with a fully functioning film industry, and I feel like as Canadian podcasters, we should maybe represent that more than we do.
So, in your opinion, which is the best Canadian movie, and why is it Cube?
There's so many good Canadian films to choose from. I don't know what I would choose. Let's to Google.
It's Cube. While Matthew's Googling, if you haven't seen Canadian produced sci-fi horror, maybe
definitely horror. It's maybe Cube. That is a horror film.
I know, is it though? But it's horrific, certainly, and wonderful. And I love very clever bottle movies, and this is a very clever movie where it's multiple bottles all connected, and each bottle has a little trap in it, and they try and work out how to get out of the trap. And it's really, really nice because it's one of those movies where they clearly shot it in the same two rooms from different angles and lighting. Because I think it was made like shoestring budget would be an over exaggeration. Like they made this with basically nothing. And if you watch it now, there's a bunch of faces in it that you now recognize after Cube really did a lot of work. And it's just really, really effective in a way that most of the sequels are not. There's one of the sequels I quite like, but the original is fantastic, and it's one of my favorite Canadian movies.
Yeah, I mean, there's three Cube movies that I'm aware of, and one of them is great, and one of them is good, and one of them is, eh.
And
It's,
and a Japanese remake, which was last year, I believe.
yeah, and I don't know if we're going to get to cover it on the podcast, but Vincenzo Natali, that was his feature debut as a writer and director. He'll be directing one of the episodes of the upcoming Guillermo del Toro Cabinet of Curiosities anthology series, and I'm very much looking forward to that.
Mhm.
He's a pretty great Canadian filmmaker. There's so many Canadian films. How am I supposed to choose one? It's not even
Sorry,
fair.
I threw it at you at the wrong moment. How about Rambo? Does Rambo count? First Blood, as it was filmed in the little town of
No,
BC.
that was filmed in Canada, but it is not a Canadian. It is a very distinctly American film.
Oh,
Um, I was trying to think. Probably in the last couple of years, I can think of two films in the last couple of years that I really, really liked. One would be "You Will Remember Me," which is a French Canadian film about a man dealing with the onset of Alzheimer's, which is just heartbreaking.
mhm.
Um, and there's another one that is called Underground, or in French Souterrain, which is
Really?
about a group of miners again in Quebec that are trapped in a like there's an accident and they're trapped, and the whole movie is just trying to get them out. Super, super good, super tense movie that I saw at Whistler. I saw both those at Whistler, I think 2 years ago. Um, Antuhara is a great film. The Fast Runner, which is a Inuit Canadian film. Wildhood last year, which is a very like a indigenous coming of age story. Super great movie. Like there's so
Mm,
many.
I know.
It's fun. It's funny because when you ask the average person on the street like what they think of Canadian film, most people seem to think that it sort of has a bad rep for some reason. People sort of look down on it. I think that has a lot to do with you know budget and marketing. But
Yeah.
there's actually the ratio of good ones, great ones, and good ones to bad ones and terrible ones is pretty well the same ratio as it is in Hollywood. Just maybe on an order of budgetary scale is different.
Yeah. As someone like I'm definitely, as you may have noticed, I lean more to genre films like zombie horrors and most of them are pretty bad. Like the ones that really stand out for me are the ones with really good style and um, if you remember back, if you're a long time listener, we covered Blood Quantum when it came out, and there were major issues with the acting, but it was directed with so much verve and energy, and actually thought an actual Canadian, genre director that is showing us something really, really exciting. And unfortunately, he died this week, just after a year of being very sick. Jeff Barnaby unfortunately passed away, so that was very, very sad for Canadian film, and he had huge prospects. I think he apparently fought very very hard to make his films made. And if you watch Blood Quantum, it's got a real kind of George Romero Dawn of the Dead, but from his angle as well. It's got this huge like indigenous issues mixed in with it as well.
Yeah, that's a great movie.
It's it, it had some issues, but his potential as a genre filmmaker. It was huge, and I haven't seen his other movie actually. Rhymes for Young Ghouls, but I heard this week from one of our mutuals that that's very very good as well. So I'll be watching that, but that's a real shame.
Yeah, and I mean it's interesting too because I think he was a somewhat early example in the last, like, say, decade or more. There's been a real shift from. I used to think that most of our best films came out of French Canada, and in the last couple of years, with things like Wildhood and Blood Quantum, and there's another one that I am forgetting the name of. Night Raiders
Oh,
is, I
no.
think, where I think a lot of our best stories are starting to come out of Indigenous culture, and he was maybe not leading the way, but he was clear he was just getting started.
Yeah, and he was using it. It wasn't just telling the indigenous story in the same way that begins with B, not bones, not birds. The film we watched last year. Oh my god, I can't remember the
Oh,
name.
you mean
With the young
Beans?
girl in it. Beans. My god, my brain. So Beans was a very good movie and told an indigenous story in that way. And what I found really interesting about Blood Quantum is that he used it as a framework for this like zombie horror as well, and it really like worked. It really,
Mm-hmm.
really, he managed to make it work, and that was the most impressive thing about that movie. And it was shot very well. The acting's not great, but the ideas behind it and the potential was massive,
I
massive.
mean, I even disagree that the acting was not. I mean, there's better performances in every film than there are, and worse ones. But
Hmm.
speaking of, I mean, if you haven't seen Night Raiders, which actually features, and I'm gonna butcher her name, but I think it's El Maya Tailfeathers, who's one
Hmm.
of the leg leads in that in Blood Quantum, is also one of the leads
Yeah,
in Night Raiders,
she's good. Yeah.
and Night Raiders is a it takes the history of residential schools in Canada and like takes it to its most extreme endpoint in a science fiction story, and it's
Hmm.
quite harrowing. I thought it was really, the ending suffers a bit from the aforementioned budgetary limitations, but it's still a pretty great movie.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Okay, so what are we covering this week?
right.
Two non-Canadian productions.
Well, yeah, two non-Canadian productions, but we can lead into this from a genre's perspective. We are going to talk first about a genre special from Marvel and Disney called Werewolf by Night, and then we're going to move on to the latest Netflix release, which is actually Germany's official entry into the Oscars for Best Foreign Language Film, All Quiet on the Western Front. But we're going to start with Werewolf by Night, which is a Disney Plus TV special. Technically, it's only about an hour long, so it's not a series and it's not a movie. Starring Gael Garcia Bernal and directed by famed composer Michael Giacchino,
Hmm.
and tells the story of Jack Russell, which, just as a side note, is a great name for a character who turns into a dog. Um, and basically, the setup of this movie is it's basically a love letter to the original Universal Monsters um, continuity, like the Frankenstein's and the Draculas and the Invisible Men of the 1930s. This movie clearly loves those, and shockingly, the Wolfman in particular. And it starts out with a group of hunters who are called to a secret meeting where the lead hunter in the world has died, and his magical artifact needs to be passed on to a new person to be the new leader of the hunters. And Gael Garcia Bernal is there, but it turns out he's a werewolf, and he's there to rescue the monster they all have to hunt and kill as part of their the ceremony to see who gets this thing. And I'm not going to lie, I very much enjoyed this. It's only about an hour long, which is just long enough so it doesn't wear out its welcome. It's shot in this really stark, high contrast black and white, which means that it's super gory without actually being overtly super gory. Um, there's a couple of really fun performances. There's a bunch of really fun effects, and I really liked it. And I think you should probably watch it. I don't know, Simon, what did you think?
Um, I thought it was in a really weird place. Like it was shot like a classic 1930s horror, like monster movie, and that's really nice for me because it's one of my earliest sort of movie experiences. Is when my parents went to bed is in those years. So this is the early '80s in Britain, and we had 3 channels, and nothing. It wasn't on demand. And BBC Two or Channel Four, or so we have 4 channels, would show often like B movies, like black and white B movies and monster movies, and it's one of the things that really made me fall in love with film. So watching something that was stylized the same way, I thought was lovely, really, really nice. I really like Gael Garcia Bernal as a performer. I think he's made some odd choices in his career, but I think he's got that kind of thing that Oscar Isaac has, which is he can play both ends of the scale. He can be kind of awkward and quiet and adorable, or he can be absolutely chilling and terrifying. And I think he's a really great performer. And he's great in this as well. He's before he I didn't know he was called Jack Russell. It's interesting for me as well because apparently all of these characters have huge comic backgrounds, and I knew nothing about any of it. So it was very interesting to go in and kind of view it surface level. And so he was great. And what I found was that it was kind of stuck in the middle. It was too gory to be a true 1930s like homage, which weren't especially gory movies. They tended to leave most of it to your imagination because they didn't have the effects. There was lots of shadow play and lots of like noises off camera and
Well,
um,
they also had to like function within the Hays Code most of the time, which would
right,
prohibit them from doing that kind of thing.
right. So it was too gory to be a true 1930s homage, but it wasn't scary or gory enough to be a true horror. I've seen a
Hmm.
couple of reports saying, "Is this Marvel's new horror?" I'm like angle. I'm like it didn't. It felt like it was restrained by the Disney of it all, by the MCU of it all. It either should have gone much more horror, or it should have dialed down because there was some very explicit gore. They should have dialed that down so my kids could watch it and let their imaginations sort of Beetlejuice. It's the same what Beetlejuice does. Like it's like leave it to the kids' imagination. You can skirt around the certification and you can still have the same effect. It's kind of I prefer it a bit less explicit. So I feel it was kind of stuck in this middle ground. What do you think?
I think that if I was 15, 16, I would have loved this thing. I think you're right that maybe it's a little bit too gory for your 8-year old and potentially almost
Yeah.
12-year old.
Yes.
But like 14, 15, 16, nah, it's totally fine. This is exactly the kind of thing I would have loved to have found on late night TV when I was like 16. You know? And I disagree that it's not horror enough. It's just like, um, I struggle with this a lot because I know that a lot of people, and I'm not trying to sound accusatory, but I know a lot of people's definition of horror is it's scary, but that's not actually what horror needs to be. This is very clearly horror in the style of 1930s Universal Monsters. It is a horror story, and I really appreciate the homage. I appreciate that Michael Giacchino, like, you can imagine the pitch meeting for this where they're like, "So, Mike, you wanna direct this? You want to direct this thing? Great. Who are you thinking to get the score to do the score?" And you just imagine them just being like, "Are you fucking with me right now?" Like, because the score is A, over the top in all of the best melodramatic ways, and B, just also kind of wonderful. Like, I've had some couple of themes running through my head since I saw this earlier this week,
Mhm.
and I really enjoyed it. I do, like I say, I think you're probably right. I think it's probably not for kids, but I think that that's okay, and I think that's not a mark against for me. A, because I'm not a kid, and B, that like, again, like, middle teenagers and older teenagers, probably this is perfect for. And
Interesting.
I don't need and I think that you're right that it's gory, but I think that the black and whiteness of it all dials it down enough to make that sort of okay, right?
Mhm.
Like there's definitely huge splatters of blood, but it might as well be like ink on screen, right? Like there's
Mm.
definitely room for the mind to interpret stuff away.
Mm. I
And I don't know, I just it's such a I think we're gonna get more into this in a minute, but like I'm also just super excited that it's a one off. Like maybe it's probably not going to be a one off at the end of the day, but like it's not a series, it's not a movie, it's a 1 hour special, it's a 1 hour love letter to these old school styles of filmmaking. It's not aimed at the coveted like 12 to 14-year-old demographic. Like to me, it represents Marvel taking Marvel's sort of continued. We're going to try targeting other people trend that they've been going through lately, and I find that very exciting.
Mm, yeah, it's nice to see something stylistically a little different. And I will say though, one thing I really disliked about this, and it's the thing that gets me, I think, more than it gets you, and that's the fight choreography and the way the fighting was shot was awful. Like really fucking bad. Like to the point where you could see people lining up for their choreography and pulling the punches, and like it's
Yeah,
a real skill. Like it's not because it was trying to be a 1930s thing. It was just bad. And
I I'm willing to I'm
there's
willing
a
to
real
write that off as a 1930s homage thing.
um, but they had a like that they were trying to do the fight in the 1930s kind of framework, and they just did it just wasn't good. There's a skill to filming it and choreographing it and acting it out in a way that can still be believable. It doesn't matter which area you're trying to emulate. It was just
Hmm.
really bad, and the last 10 minutes is basically a big fight, and all of it I was just like, oh no, it's just terrible. It's really bad.
Yeah, I did not find that to be. I guess maybe because my expectations when it comes to Marvel fight choreography is fairly low at this point. I did not find that to be a problem. I like you say it doesn't get me as much, but I think I'm just sort of desensitized to it now because I don't really expect Marvel's fight choreography to be spectacular or even necessarily good.
But the problem is,
I
in Moon Knight, it was exceptional. So
I see. No, I disagree. It was
they can
exactly
do
the
it.
same. It was exactly the same in Moon Knight. I'm sorry. The
I
like
don't know.
it's been kind of middling most of the time. Even in the ones that people think where it's good, like Captain America: The Winter Soldier, it's
Mm,
in that one. To be fair, the choreography is amazing, but the few times they get the choreography really right, they fuck up the filming of it. So
mm,
it's sort of zero sum. It's always either one or the other. It's always either I can see it and it's not great, or I can't. It is great, but I can't see it.
mm.
And I'm sort of I'm sort of just over it, I guess, is maybe where I'm at with this. I'd much rather just laugh at Gael Garcia Bernal revealing that the giant, that the monster he's there to save is Man Thing, who is a super weird character, and I'm just glad to see them in the MCU. And I would much rather laugh at that being revealed that his name is Ted
Is that
than
from the comics? Is that just something they made up? Is he named in the comics?
honestly, I don't remember off the top of my head, but I don't care. Like it was such a wonderful moment where they're like, "What's he called?" And he's like, "Ted."
Yeah.
Just like it doesn't matter because that moment is so good, and I really enjoyed that. I'd much rather just focus on things like Harriet Sansom Harris, who plays Verussa Bloodstone, who's the
Mm,
like lover and wife of the elder hunter who's just died, who clearly understands what type of movie she's in maybe better than anyone else, and just dials every aspect of her performance to 11. Um, in like but not in like a bad way, like in a perfect way, like in a
mm,
perfectly over the top 30s serial kind of way. And I even liked, I also like Laura Donnelly. I know you can't tell her apart from Kristen Ritter, but I really liked Laura Donnelly as Elsa Bloodstone, the sort of prodigal daughter who's returning home after years of estrangement. And I thought the whole thing was really fun. I thought it was super fun, and that's all I want from these things anymore. Really, is for them to be. If Marvel's going to keep making movies, and let's be clear, they're going to keep making movies and
mm,
TV shows. I want them to either be meaningful or fun or both.
mhm.
And for me, this was a fun one, and I am perfectly fine with it being just that.
Yeah, it was very light. I mean, maybe that's why when it finished, I was just like, yeah, it is very like it doesn't go too far in any direction, and it is fun, but it is also kind of disposable. Would you agree?
I mean, but that's fine. Like they're all at the end of the day, they're all kind of disposable. Like there's not really one that's like I can't think of one off the top of my head right now that would be like preserved in like by for like cultural reasons, right? Like when films get added to the National Archive or whatever in America,
Yeah, it's not
like
quite that level.
I don't think any of them are going to be that. I think if they're gonna keep making just entertainment like comic book story, this is the other thing too. I very much appreciate that Marvel stuff is getting more comic booky because comic books
Oh,
have a
yeah.
wide variety of tones and styles and art
Mm,
styles, and I just love that they are leaning into
mm.
there's and it's and also this is maybe a personal thing, but I love that all the dude bros online are just melting down because like the more comic booky Marvel stuff gets, the more they seem to hate
It's
it.
fine. It's fine. Not everyone likes comic books or understands how to tell a comic book story. If they don't like comic
Yeah,
books, that's fine. But if they do, then they have a problem.
yeah. So
It's
anyway,
not about, it's not about the comics, is it? Clearly, at this point.
no, not at all. Either way, though, like I say, I thought this was super fun. I hope that they keep doing holidays. Like this is a one-off, 1 hour Halloween special. We know we're getting the Guardians of the Galaxy holiday special before we get Guardians of the Galaxy 3. And I kind of hope that they just keep doing holiday specials. Like give me Werewolf by Night again, but give me another 1 hour episode next Halloween. Or give me a holiday special. Like just give me these things. Give me more random stuff because I
Yeah,
am enjoying it so far.
and give Michael Giacchino. You're the Italian speaker. Giacchino.
Giacono. Giacono.
The double C is a K. Okay.
Yeah.
So give Michael Giacchino just more stuff to direct because you can hear it from his music. He's a really fun guy.
Yeah.
I've seen some interviews with him. There's a great article about how he was given basically a week to write the Rogue One soundtrack, and because when they re-edited it, the original composer couldn't work it into a schedule. So they're like, "Michael, do you want to do Star Wars?" And his kids were like, "Yes, yes, he would like to do Star Wars." And they're like, "Great, you've got a week. You got like 10 days." And he just hit it. If you listen to the Rogue One soundtrack, you can just hear like him just really going for it. And he's a really fun guy, and that really comes through in his direction of this as well. Like I think it's a really funly directed, if that makes sense. I think
Yep.
there's a lot of levity to it. So yeah, give him more stuff, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, the only thing I know for sure he's directed is he directed one of these Star Trek short treks,
Oh,
and
which one?
it was called. Hang on, I'll have to bring it up here. It's an animated one though, and it's called Ephraim and Dot, and it's a wonderful little story. He's actually turns out he's a really good director, and speaking of which, of his like fun style, like I don't know if he's by far my favorite working composer these days. But one of the things I love about him, aside from the fact that he makes good music, is that if you ever read the track titles on his scores, they are amazing, and it's
Yes.
clearly because he just is a fun guy. Like
Mm.
there's in Ghost Protocol, which he scored, and the score for that, there's obviously if you've seen that movie, which of course you have, the big final fight takes place in this like automated parking garage, and the music that plays is called "World's Worst Parking Valet." Uh, uh, Doctor
and
Strange has a track called "Astral World's Worst Killer."
and the Star Trek soundtrack has tons of really terrible Trek puns in the titles as well. That's worth.
Oh yeah, one of my favorite pieces of music he's ever written is the music that plays in 2009's Star Trek movie when Kirk and Bones are in a shuttlecraft, and you get to see this. They fly up from Earth towards the starbase, and it's the first time you see the Enterprise on screen. And it's this wonderfully like triumphant score, and the track is called "Enterprising Young Men."
Oh,
Yeah,
Michael.
Yeah, there's a in Spider-Man: Far From Home when he's fighting like the water monster. I believe that's the one that's called World's Worst Water Feature. It's the, so he just seems like a super fun guy.
Yeah.
And I want him to keep making stuff. I think he's overdue for a second Oscar, and maybe he can get it for directing at some point. Who knows?
Mhm. Yeah.
Anyway, so
Okay.
how
But
many
yeah, watch
how
it.
many how many stars out of five for
All right.
you?
It's a solid 3. It's fine. It was. I really liked the black and white, and I it feels wrong to reference Schindler's List, but he does the same thing as Spielberg does with the flash of red against the black and white. I thought it was super effective.
Yeah,
I really liked how I was expecting full like werewolf transformation, but he absolutely went to the Wolfman transformation, which is a man with fake teeth and a little bit of hair around his face, and I appreciated that too.
I actually
So
really like. I actually really like the sequence when he transforms with his shot facing away from him with someone else looking horrified and shadows on the wall, and I really enjoyed
mm,
that sequence in particular. It's in the trailer, so it's not a spoiler, just for the record.
yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
So 3. How about you?
For me, it's 4. I had too much fun for it to be anything other than a 4.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Okay.
And I honestly can't. If even if Werewolf by Night just becomes like an annual holiday special, I would love that. Because
Mm-hmm.
the other thing is that now that they've shown that they can do this kind of story in an hour, why do they keep making like 6 hour miniseries and movies? Like they can just do more like this. Like if they can make an episode of TV that's this good in an hour, I wish they could just because like you could definitely see where this whole thing would get stretched out to like 7 or 8 half-hour episodes or 4 1 hour episodes, and I'm glad they
Mm.
didn't do that this time.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
definitely.
it drops you in, it does everything it needs to do, and it gets the hell out.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
perfectly executed in that way.
yeah. That's true.
Yeah, so 4 for me.
Okay, excellent.
Yeah. Well, let's move on to headier
Slow,
material.
the slow in the
Uh,
tone.
yeah, let's just change things up a little bit. So next up, we are talking about All Quiet on the Western Front, which is the latest adaptation of the 1929 novel of the same name, famously previously adapted in 1930, won a ton of Oscars. It's been
Mhm.
adapted a number of times. Um, why don't you give us the rundown on this one?
So All Quiet on the Western Front, like, is like I said, shot from the German perspective of the First World War, sending basically hordes of young boys to the trenches, and it's no spoiler to let you know that it is an horrific experience because the film wants to point out the war is heck. Like it's very different. We were talking about this before we started recording, that I was thinking a lot about 1917, that the movie that won the Oscar 1917, shot in its like simulated single shot, which I really, really liked. I really, really liked that movie. And this film makes an interesting comparison and even a companion piece because it kind of takes all of the darker elements of 1917 and it feels like it amplifies them on a more realistic level. Like there's a couple of shots in the new War Quiet on the Western Front where the our main character, we follow a young boy called Paul, played by Felix Camera, and there's a couple of shots where he's running into camera with things happening behind him, and that happens in 1917 a few times as well. And I just feel like Western Front fills the frame with more awfulness. Do you know what I mean? Like it takes the idea of 1917, which is to show the horrific way these boys were treated, and of course from a different country's perspective, but it's the same thing. And it is it's 2.5 hours long almost, and it is brutal. And it's interesting in that it's not constantly brutal. Like it's not um you're not sad for the whole thing. There are moments of levity where these boys sort of bond together with the slightly older fighters who have been there longer. And there's moments where they're like they steal a goose and they cook it all together, and it's so effective in giving you that moment of showing them as being these happy boys, and then just forcing them into this terrible situation. And in the second half of this movie, it increasingly cuts back to the generals who are eating off their fine plates, their silverware, and talking about the relationship with their parents and eating this fine food. In fact, there's one battle that cuts between a general dinner and the most awful experiences these boys are having on the battlefield, whilst the official negotiator is trying to call a truce with the French equivalent. Um, so you've got all these elements happening, and basically, it wants to show you how the horror and futility of this war is not something we should ever forget. And it's very interesting for me because I'm English, and so I watched a lot of war movies growing up. And guess what? A lot of them were kind of gung ho and heroic, and we won, like Battle Britain, and chin up, boys, and we stormed the beach. And from the German point of view, you're not going to get that same kind of movie for multiple obvious reasons, and it is horrific. Like, what's your take on this?
Yeah, this movie. It's interesting. You bring up 1917 because one thing I said after I watched it to my wife is that this movie is basically what I wanted 1917 to be.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like 1917 is a very well made movie. Don't get me wrong, and it does put its lead character through the ringer, but in a way where it still comes away, you know, heroic, for lack of a
Mm-hmm.
better word. Very, there's a hopeful moment at the end. This movie is not that. This movie shows that they're young, they're boys, they're being literally fed into a meat grinder. Especially like they go over the top. They come out of the trenches and charge several times in this movie, and it is
Mm-hmm.
harrowing every single time.
I have no idea how the hell they could manage to direct quite long shots that are
Yeah,
tracking these boys running across. It's incredible to watch.
yeah, and it's also, I mean, just to stick on 1917 for a second, it also highlights. So 1917. Don't be wrong. I think Roger Deakins is a genius, and I think Sam Mendes is a good director, and I think that it kind of gets lost in the gimmick of it
Mm-hmm.
simulating one long take a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And All Quiet on the Western Front uses a absolute ton of super long takes as well, but then knows when to cut and when to move and when to change angles. And I feel like the visual storytelling is stronger for it,
Mm-hmm.
personally. But still, you still get all of the effectiveness of the long takes, especially those charges through no man's land. The opening 10 minutes of this film are basically a short film in and of themselves. That is one of the most harrowing things I think I've ever seen. Like if you told me that opening sequence leading up to Paul getting his uniform, um, if you told me that sequence was like a short film that won an Oscar, I'd be like, yeah, of course it is. It's so beautifully shot and so gut wrenchingly just visceral. Like it just drops you right in.
Yeah.
Or it just doesn't really drop you right. Like it takes a minute to like it's very quiet, and then there's a few gunshots, and then there's a few more gunshots, and then you're in no man's land, and then you're in the middle of a battle, and a man dies, and then it takes you through the whole sequence of all these soldiers' bodies being stripped of their uniforms, the uniforms being repaired, and then handed to a new group of young boys.
Yeah.
And it's just gut wrenching to watch.
That circular feeding motion of boys in, boys out is something that's carried on through the whole movie and used as kind of bookends as well. And
A little bit, yeah.
it's incredibly effective, and it really highlights like the admin people who are back safe and sound on the bases. Who there's one scene where after having pulled the dog tags off corpses, the bags get sent back so the families can be told, and there's just a pile of metal dog tags, and they pull out one by one and they read out the names and date of birth. But so flippantly and like joking around that yesterday was his birthday, and then throwing it to the side, and is like all of there is so much of uh, safe people, kind of treating this whole thing flippantly, like generals and the army officers who are doing all this, and then the contrast of the soldiers on the front line is incredibly effective, and it's devastating as well. I mean, it's definitely the kind of movie that there's no such thing as a happy ending in this movie. So it's pretty clear early on how they're going to make their final point, and it's just devastating to see them get to that point. But a
Hmm.
standout for me, the acting was phenomenal from everyone, but the
Hmm.
standout for me again in pretty much in every movie he's ever in is Daniel Brühl, sorry,
Yeah,
who
I was gonna bring him up next. Yeah,
who is always amazing, and in English and in German, but he in this he's got a
he's
really interesting part here because he's desperately trying to stop all these boys getting killed by negotiating with the French,
yeah
and
he's like
yeah,
the one sympathetic non-soldier in the whole movie, pretty
yeah,
much.
yeah, yeah.
He plays real historical figure Matthias
Oh,
Erzberger,
oh, I
the
didn't know.
man who signed the armistice that ended the war.
Hmm.
Um, and there's so many scenes of him, like that scene you mentioned with the dog tags. He's in that scene. There's these two people, like one person reading out names and dates of birth, and one person writing them down. And at a certain point, he's just like, enough. It's enough. It's enough.
Hmm.
And even the moment when he's like, there's a moment where the French offer him conditions for surrender, and they're like, you have 72 hours, and he's like, 50,000 people could die in, or say 72 hours, and he's like, 50,000 people could die in that time, and the German and the French guy is just like, so sign.
Hmm.
Like, I don't care. Like, sign it then.
Hmm.
It's so callous and cold, and like, I mean, World War I is a complicated topic, and I know that there's a whole discussion of the Treaty of Versailles and how that eventually led to World War II and all that kind of
Hmm.
stuff. But like, there's a real like callousness from those French generals, but the callousness is not just from them; it's from
Yeah.
literally everyone else in the movie except for Erzberger. And in particular, there's one German general who's like
Hmm.
longing for a victorious battle, which he won't go into himself, but wants
Hmm.
to claim credit. And it's just
Yeah.
so harrowing.
Yeah.
And
It's
yeah,
yeah.
it's funny how all you have to do to make an anti-war film is to show a realistic depiction of war.
Yeah.
Uh, because it turns out that war is hell, and we've all known that the whole time. And no matter how many times someone tells you you can go be a hero, ultimately you're going to end up face down in the muck, stuck in a hole in no man's land with an enemy soldier who you've murdered to death.
Yeah, and like Erzberger has this moment where the generals are like, so they'll come home, they'll starve on the way home instead of dying with honor on the battlefield. He's like, well, my son died in this war. Where's his honor? Like,
Yeah.
where that this idea of fake of honor is so destructive. This false. Another point he says that what's stopping us is our false pride in trying to be the victor, and it's so desperate. And of course, it's so relevant now looking at what's going on in Ukraine and how desperate it is there and how awful the atrocities are and how helpless you feel watching that news story is the same when you watch these boys being told to run across a field and being with them and just not being able to influence that. And the I don't know, the standard for wartime like shocking battle scenes for many years was the D-Day landings in Saving Private Ryan, which
Mm-hmm.
Spielberg, it's he's a brilliant director and it is fantastic. I feel like the war scenes in this were more realistic and more harrowing and genuinely terrifying because you are in the point of view that it keeps you very close to this little group that forms, and so when you see flames, or the French tanks coming through the mist, and it's just awful. But in a way, it's meant to be. Like, it's so effective.
I mean, I think it's just meant to be. I mean,
Yes.
the details of this film are so. I don't know if correct is the right word for it, but anytime they're crossing no man's land, like every puddle is tinged red,
Hmm.
except and like when they're running through the mist in one time, and as they get further toward the French lines and more of them are being shot, the mist turns slowly red, and it's from the mist of them being shot, like it's the red mist of them being shot.
Mm,
And then that scene you mentioned with the tanks coming out of the mist on the other side, because it's the same scene. Like they are being followed by a yellow mist because they've just dropped gas,
mm,
and
yeah.
the whole thing is like the the tank scene in particular in this film
Mm,
is terrifying.
yeah.
In a way where like the end of Saving Private Ryan, where they're fighting the Panzer tanks and the Tiger tanks in that tiny village, is also terrifying. Um, because tanks are just terrifying if you're not also in a tank. But this one where it's the tanks are running over the top of the trenches and in one case
Mm,
falling into the trench, and it just the camera like at no point looks away from what
mm,
happens when this kind
mm.
of thing happens. And it's yeah, I mean, yeah,
The
it's terrifying, and it's so. I mean, Daniel Bruhl. Don't be wrong. Daniel Bruhl is amazing in this. I would prefer to shout out Felix Kammerer, who
Yeah,
plays
it's
Paul,
incredible.
and Albrecht Schuck. I don't know how to
Hmm.
pronounce his name. Who plays Kat? Who are like the two sort of main characters.
Hmm.
Um, are both so effective. Uh,
Hmm.
Paul from like when we first meet Kat, he's been on the front lines for a while, so he's a little bit desensitized to it all.
Hmm.
Um, but then when his moments of humanity like shine through, they shine so brightly. And
Hmm.
because Felix's performance starts out so bright and so young and so hopeful
Hmm.
that by the end, when he's basically the shell of a human being at all, it's so effective. His performance in those moments is so
Hmm.
effective.
And it's very subtle how he changes his body language from the beginning and the end when it comes to killing people. Like, there's
Yeah,
in one of the last battles that leads to another harrowing moment. He has changed so completely from this very nervous, like, person firing, like misfiring their rifle almost into the air in the first fight, to being a really effective killer, but without any kind of thought behind it. It's very, very it's a great performance.
yeah, and then that's one of the scenes that's bookended by he's the young hapless soldier in the first battle,
Mm,
where Kat is the experienced one, and then in the last battle he's the experienced
mm.
one, and there's a new kid, and like
Yeah.
that parallel is just so goddamn effective.
Yeah, and it was really awful. You've talked about the beginning as well, but there's a scene where the boys are desperate to go, and they're so happy, and the headmaster of the school is reading all their names out and giving them this like rip roaring speech about defending the fatherland, and you'll be in Paris by Christmas, and blah blah blah. And like, that hindsight is a terrible thing when like that this is um where this is going, how it's going to end, and the lies, because the people, the people, the adults in the room know that they're sending these boys most likely to their death, and it's just so infuriating that could have ever happened that way, which I'm sure it did on all sides.
And not even just in this war. Like I think it's a pretty well established um, pattern of history of rich or nobility, the rich or the nobility or the higher ups of society being like, go to war, distinguish yourself as a hero, earn glory, and perhaps maybe join me on my tier of society, maybe if you're lucky and I let you
Yeah,
anyway.
yeah. Come back
Um,
with an iron cross in a few months. It's
right.
just
And then
the lies.
you can be a factory worker
Yeah.
if you have both your hands.
Uh,
It's
so we've talked a lot tonally about this film, but we sound like we're being really, really negative. But I just want to point out that technically,
I
this
don't.
film
I
is
don't
a
think we're.
masterpiece.
I don't think that we're sounding negative at all. I think
Oh,
we're
good,
just.
good, good. It's
I think.
just
I think that we're grappling with the material, which
yeah,
is, which is. I mean, there's no other word for it. It is
it's horrific.
brutal. It's
Yeah, it's
brutal.
horrific.
It's horrific. It is gut wrenching. It is. This movie is very technically a masterpiece.
Yeah,
It is so well shot. I actually would like. I was gonna. The next thing I wanted to come to actually was I really liked the score, which I'm sure some people will find a bit jarring because it's a bit anachronistic. It's very
it
modern,
is. Yeah,
very
yeah,
like industrial
yeah.
score
Metallic.
that
Yeah.
very metallic, and it doesn't pop up that much. In keeping with the title of the film,
Mm.
a lot of this film is super quiet,
Yeah, the
and
silence is used so well.
when the music does pop up, it is made more effective as a result. And when it pops up, it doesn't just like fade in. It it, it drops into the scene and like gives it an effect
Yeah,
that
yeah.
will just shake you up. And I really really like that about it.
It's interesting, and actually, you've reminded me of something I thought about when I was watching it and listening to the soundtrack and thinking exactly the same thing as you are. Um, that so much of this is shot almost like a horror movie, like a classic horror movie. You talked about werewolves and by night, and like what makes a horror. For me, this is a true horror movie
Mm-hmm.
because this isn't just a jump scare and then a finale. This is true horror, and it is filmed in that way. It is filmed as an explicit horror, and murders are quick and dirty. Like um, there's a couple of moments where he's up front in trenches or in ditches, and it's not just a bullet and they're down. There's some extended killing in this, and it is horrific. So, yeah, this is a true horror. But technically, it's incredible movie. Incredible.
I
I
mean,
don't know who this
yeah,
director is, but
I think that's actually one of the great strengths of the film. And I can't remember, to be perfectly honest, how well or how much 1917 or any other war film does this, but in a way where lots of other war films would cut away and leave it to your imagination, and this
yeah,
film almost never does. And
yeah,
and in a lot of other films, when the killing happens, if it's left on screen, it's kind of sensationalized to the point where it doesn't feel real.
hmm
Um, and this film never does that. This film, it's always dirty, it's always brutal, it's always the ordeal that it must be in real life.
hmm
And I also very much appreciated that about it, because it's just like, again, all you have to do to make an anti-war film is shoot a realistic depiction of war,
hmm
and that is what this movie is. It feels real on a level that I don't think a war movie has felt in quite a while.
It's weird though that we're talking about how horrific it is to watch, and I'm only gonna compare it to Blonde because of how I talked about Blonde. Not obviously, we're not getting into the qualities of them, but it's um, one of my main criticisms of Blonde is that it was horrific from beginning to end with no contrast or lighter moments to make the horrific seem more horrific. It was just all down. And this movie does have, it's very, very clever in letting us see them happy so that when we see them sad, it's even worse. It's a much better kind of horrific. So we it is a horrific movie, but it's one you should absolutely watch. Like
Yeah,
everyone should watch this film. Absolutely.
I agree. Yeah,
How many
with
stars
all of the
would you
things you're saying here.
How many stars would you like to give All Quiet on the Western Front? 2022, not 1930.
So I would say it's at least four. I've been struggling with this actually.
Mm-hmm.
I gave it four when I first finished watching it, and the more I think about it, the more that we talk about it, the more I think it might actually be a five.
Hmm.
You?
It's a five for me. It's I studied this era in college when I studied history for a couple of years, and so it feels very true to that horrors that I learned about, and it's the kind of movie that I think needs to be watched, and it is so technically brilliant, brilliantly directed, and brilliantly acted, and utterly chilling and horrifying. And I, uh, I think it's probably the best war movie I've seen in years, like true war movie, maybe even decades, because it captures, it doesn't glamorize anything. And you're right, it's very interesting how you talk about 1917. I loved 1917, but there were definitely moments where it was more about it being a one shot than about being the drama. And this is there isn't a wasted frame in this or a wasted moment, and the contrast between the elements is so brilliantly done that it
Yeah.
should definitely get that Oscar nomination, if not
And
win.
just, I mean, I don't want to spoil the end of the movie for anyone, but the end of 1917, it ends with a moment of contemplation and a, like, how will I ever go home after this? But it's still, ultimately, he has been the hero. He's been through a bunch of things, but ultimately he's achieved his goal and he's been the hero. Um,
Mhm.
he's still like the young British soldier. He's going to go home and have a medal pinned on his chest and tell stories at dinner parties. All Quiet on the Western Front is a
Oh.
is a truer depiction of how we take young men and feed them into a meat grinder.
Hmm.
it's it's
True.
and I'm sort of, and I say this as someone who friggin' adored Top Gun Maverick this year, that I'm sort of over the propaganda version of war, uh, which is an interesting thing for me to now have to reconcile. But
uh, yeah, you could like both. Like Maverick's a very different kind of movie. Like
yeah,
it's entertainment versus reality. I think is a fair separation.
yeah, and I think the and I liked 1917. Just to be clear, that uh, that feels very much like entertainment, and this feels very much like reality,
Hmm.
and in a way where you could make an argument that 1917 is an anti-war film as well. And again, any film that shows any realistic depiction of war is pretty much an anti-war film at this point. But
Hmm.
it it still comes out of it with a, like, you could survive. You could, if you join up and do the thing, you'll
Hmm.
survive. And this is very much like, war is hell. You will probably die, and you'll
Hmm.
probably lose everything,
Horribly.
and you will probably lose everything about yourself before you do.
Yay.
So, like, don't get me wrong, this movie is a bummer, but it is, yeah, it's one of the, I would say it's one of the best films of the year.
Why did you come out of this thinking four? I'm really curious what didn't make it a five for you out of your initial after your initial viewing.
I don't actually really know. I think it's part of. Um, I find that my opinions can be kind of fluid for the first little while after I see something.
Hmm.
Um, and there were definitely moments where I was like, "Is this too much, or is it not enough?"
Hmm.
And I'm also super reluctant to give out fives at this point. And I think so. At the time we're recording this, I watched this last night, and I think what makes it a five now is just the more I think about it, the more I think about it,
Yeah,
and
no, it's certainly
and
right.
and certainly our discussion thereof has helped as well. So
Hmm.
I think that has bumped it to a five for me.
Okay,
Yeah,
awesome.
good.
Good. So yes, watch both of these things. Enjoy
Yeah,
one and be horrified by the other.
yeah. Well, if you want to watch both these things, luckily, Werewolf by Night is already out on Disney Plus, and if you haven't seen it in your top row, I would be shocked because they are promoting the shit out of it because it's Marvel. All Quiet on the Western Front is actually currently playing in its limited theatrical release. If you live in Toronto, you can see it at the TIFF Bell Lightbox, and if you live in Vancouver, you can see it at the VIF Center. And it's also playing in Ottawa, Calgary, Victoria, Edmonton, Waterloo, a number of other Canadian cities. If you Google it, you will find listings, but it will debut on Netflix on October the 28th. So in about 13 days, in about 2 weeks, you'll be able to watch it on Netflix. But if you live in any of the cities where it's playing, I would be super jealous of you getting to see this on a big screen.
Oh, it could be like that might be like too much for me to see this on the big screen.
Yeah, but I mean, isn't everything kind of too much for you on a big screen right now? I mean,
Excuse me. I watched DC League of Super Pets and I was totally fine. Thank you.
Yeah, well, it's first time for everything. Yeah, so like I say, if you live in any of those cities, and there is a full list if you Google it, but it's definitely worth seeing on a big screen. I wish that I had. But again, 28th of October, it'll be on Netflix, and you should definitely seek it out because it is again Germany's entrant for the best international Oscar race, and I haven't seen a lot of the other entrants to that race at this point, but I feel like it's going to be stiff competition with that and say Decision to Leave and Broker out of Japan and Korea, respectively.
It might win because India is not putting forward RRR. It's chosen a different movie.
Yeah, although, did you not hear that the producers of RRR are putting it forward in like literally every other category? and honestly, I hope it wins them all. That would be amazing. Yeah, it's been a good year for international cinema. It's yeah, good. I've actually been keeping a list. So every year we do our top 10 at the end of the year, and I've been trying to like expand that a little bit to be like favorite performances and favorite films and a few other things. And this year I've been keeping a list of like favorite like scenes or moments from films as well. And this is the opening of this film will definitely make that list. Like 100% it will.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
So, yeah.
Good. What are we talking about next week then? What's on the cards?
I have no idea because life is busy.
We could do a Halloween special and watch the 2 Happy Death Days, and then It Follows.
Yeah, we could watch
my favorite Halloween movies.
Yeah, I'm actually I'm kind of upset that we won't be able to watch or talk about Guillermo del Toro's Cabinet of Curiosities because of scheduling, unfortunately. So it would have to come out of our normal flow. But I might
What's the embargo for that then?
It's like a day or two after we normally release an episode.
Oh, dear.
But I'm very much looking forward to watching that. But yeah, we will have something next week. I don't yet know what it is, but we'll be back with something next week. In the meantime, this is where we say thank you to everyone who has been listening to this episode and every other. We do love each and every one of you. And if you have liked what you have heard, please consider giving us a 5-star review on your podcasting platform of choice and smash that subscribe button because that helps the most. And if there's a like button, smash that one too. It's those things help immeasurably. But if you do want to help a little more directly, we do have a Patreon, which you can find in the show notes, but it's just linked in the show notes, and so is our coffee. If you'd like to interact with us, we would love to hear from you. And the easiest way to interact with us is on Twitter. You can find me at SmatthewAF, and you can find him at Temporary Pen, and you can find us at Awesome Friday CA. We are some variation of those on basically every social platform that we are actually on. And we would love to hear from you. We do also have a email form on the website if you are our age and don't do social media. Yeah, we record and produce this here in Vancouver on the unceded lands of the Musqueam and Tsleil-Waututh and Squamish nations. I have been Matthew. He has been Simon. Thank you so much for listening and for joining us on this Awesome Friday.